Hello everyone, and welcome back to another one of my chess tournament recaps. Today we're going to be looking at my first ever classical chess tournament that I played over the board on March 26th and 27th. And this is another 5-game tournament, and I haven't played any online tournaments since I made my last recap. However, there is the Ontario Chess Challenge, I believe it's called, that I'll be playing in on May 22nd, so be sure to keep out for that. And also, don't mind the giant knight on the screen. That's just to block out the moves so I can explain them without you guys just looking over and seeing which move I played. Without further ado, let's get into the games. In my first game, I had the white pieces here, and I played d4. My opponent responds with d5, c4, and knight f6. This is the Marshall defense. Personally, I do not recommend playing this system against the Queen's Gambit, as it can very quickly turn sour for black. And in this game, I mean, you'll see what happens. I take the pawn in the center, he takes with the knight, and I push e4. This is the reason I don't typically recommend this kind of system, because you just give white the whole center, and they're going to have fast development. He plays knight back to f6, knight c3 defending my e4 pawn, and knight c6. Now, this is even worse for black because you're just putting a knight in a spot where it's going to be attacked by a pawn, and that's exactly what I do. I play d5, he plays knight e5, and now I always forget to play this move because I'm never fully ready for a Marshall because no one really plays it. And that move is f4. f4 is just completely winning almost. However, in this game, I play bishop f4, attacking the knight, and he goes knight back to d7. Now here I took a little bit of time because I was looking at a move knight b5, because at first I didn't see a way to stop this from happening. And of course, if he just if I could play this right now, let's say h6, this would actually lead to him having to take my knight with his queen because his king has no moves. Obviously, that did not happen in the game, because if knight b5, what I did calculate was e5, d takes e5 en passant, bishop b4 check, and it was here where I kinda didn't see a continuation, because I'm either gonna have to bring my bishop back or move my king or bring my knight back, which all kind of ruin the point of this move, if that makes sense. So instead of that, I play e5, and e5 is very, very bad for black because the knight has no moves. You can't go here, you can't go here, you get taken by the queen, so the knight is forced back to g8, which we're on move 8, and it looks like black has just lost a pawn, or traded a c pawn for an e pawn, and then played knight back and forth for 10 moves. So here I continue pressing forward with the move e6. He takes, and plays knight b6. And now, it's very, very bad for black because you can't really develop. Your knight is not really going to be able to get in the game fast enough, and now I go with knight b5. And the point is, you can't stop it. If you trade queens, for example, you still can't stop it. Your only move really is to take my pawn, or else let's say h6. This is actually checkmate. So if you take my pawn, I'm just gonna win a bunch of material here, and the game is simply over. So after knight b5, my opponent actually finds a really crafty resource, which is knight d5. Knight d5 attacks my bishop. It stops a queen trade, which is one of the things that would also be winning for white, and it also defends against knight takes c7. However, there's still a move here that is winning for white, and it's actually queen takes d5. Queen takes d5, and now knight c7 check, which wins the queen right back, and now I'm up a piece. He takes my pawn, and I go knight back to c7, forking his rook and bishop. He plays rook c8, knight takes e6 check, and king back to e8. Now I I play knight c7 again, king out to f7, bishop c4 check, and here my opponent makes another mistake, and he plays e6, which allows my bishop to take, forking his king and his rook. He plays king f6, I take his rook, of course, and he plays bishop b4 check, bishop d2 blocking. I was perfectly okay if he did this. I mean, like, white's just up a lot of material here. There's nothing really that can go wrong. So I was completely fine with not having my right to castle. However, that doesn't happen in the game, and he plays bishop d6, attacking my knight. I throw in bishop c3 check, king back to f7, queenside castle, bishop takes knight, rook d7, and here my opponent plays king f8, and I decide not to take back the bishop, but play bishop g7 check. He plays king e8, only move, and now I play knight f3, still not taking the bishop or the rook that are both hanging. And here my opponent plays bishop f4 check, saving the bishop, but I play king b1, knight f6 is played, and it was in this, not in this position, but in this position I played rook e1, he played bishop e3, rook takes e3, knight e4, and in this position there was checkmate on the board, and the game was over. So I had a strong start to the game. I should also mention now that I was playing in the under 1,000 section, which you might think, if you know my online rating, is very low, which it is. However, what balances this tournament out is that there's a lot of unrated players like myself and also my friend who's also playing in this tournament that were also in the section. So it wasn't just me beating up on a bunch of 1,000s, it was me and a collective of people beating up on a bunch of 1,000s. But moving on to the second game, here I had the white pieces again, and I played d4 once again. c6 was played, c4, not bishop, what am I talking about? D5, knight c6, bishop f5, and here I decide to trade in the center and play bishop f4, pretty much saying I'm going to point all my pieces over here and going to beat you. My opponent plays knight f6, I play e3, allowing my bishop to have some room, and here my opponent plays a6, which to the untrained eye looks like kind of a waste of tempo. Usually you'd want to develop your knight, maybe play e6, develop your bishop, maybe g6, develop your bishop that way, try and get castled. But it actually does a lot because it stops my pieces from coming in, and it also prepares the move b5 in the future. Here I play queen b3, which again looks like a move that you wouldn't necessarily play this early, like you'd want to develop some pieces first. However, it attacks two pawns and also induces the move b5, which is what my opponent plays. Here I play a4, continuing to negate my development to create some counterplay on the queen side of the board as fast as I can before my opponent consolidates into an equal position. And here my opponent plays an interesting move, which is queen a5, which pins my knight to my king, but also pins my pawn to my rook, meaning I can't take on b5, which is one of the points of playing a4 to begin with. So here I start developing my pieces with knight f3. He plays h6, which is not as useful as a6 was because my pieces weren't really going to go to g5 anyway. So I played bishop e2. Like, I can't go to d3 like if my king was on, or queen was on d1. And here he follows up h6 with g5. And now you can go back here, but I thought it was better to go to e5 because you pin the knight to the rook, and to me it just seemed more logical, even though usually you'd want your knight on e5. So here he plays bishop g7, dealing with the pin, and there's actually a winning move here for white that I missed, which is bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and queen takes d5, which forks the rook and the bishop, and also just leads to a completely winning position, and I missed this idea. However, the game continues in a similar fashion. First, I play castle, and what castles does is it protects my rook, which unpins my pawn. So because of that, he plays b4, and I play knight a2, putting a lot more pressure than it seems actually on this pawn. And he plays knight c6 and rook c1. And this entire game is going to depend on whether I can get his queen and knight away from this pawn and crack down on his position. He plays rook c8, which doesn't quite pin his knight to his rook yet because his bishop protects it. However, I play rook c5, queen b6. There's not really a better square for it. If you go back to d8, I just take the pawn, and you can't go behind the knight because you lose your queen. Now I play rook c1, and now the rook is pinned. You can play this, except again, I just win the pawn, so there's not really a point to that. I will mention, this idea still remains, and it's actually here that I actually notice it and take his knight. Sorry about that. I played bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and queen takes d5, which attacks his bishop, and his rook. Here he plays bishop e6, which skewers my queen to my knight, and here he doesn't actually take my knight. If you take, it actually leads to a very strong attack here, where it's just very difficult to play into this. I'm not sure if this is what he missed, or he just missed my knight hanging, but it was actually in this position my opponent played bishop f5, just completely giving me the bishop, and then king g7, and now I go with bishop d3, the same idea, trying to checkmate on h7. He plays rook h8 to stop it, and I jump in with queen d7, saying, okay, I'm going to win this knight or the rook. And he actually plays rook d8, which is actually a very strong move. However, I have this counter shot, rook takes c6, and if you take my rook, I'm going to take back with my queen and simply be up a piece and a rook. He doesn't go for that. He plays bishop takes d7, rook takes, and all the way back to knight a2. My knight actually defends my rook, which helped my position in the long run. Even if knight a2 wasn't the best move, I'm still very happy I played it because it allowed for a really strong positional advantage here, defending my knight. Although, technically, my bishop stops mate as well. My rook is very strong where it is. So strong, in fact, that he plays rook c7, takes, rook b4, still defending against the back rank. g4 is played, knight d2, e5, and although I can't take this pawn, I elect to just take away all back rank possibilities and play g3. Here he plays bishop bishop e7, attacking my rook. Rook c4, attempting to trade. Rook b7, attacking my b2 pawn, and b4. Here he goes knight d7, I attack his rook and his pawn. Rook back to d8, bishop takes g4, bishop f6, attacking my pawn. I just take it. If you take my rook, I take with check, and then just knight c3, for example. He doesn't do that. He takes my pawn, knight b3, rook back to b8, knight to c5, rook d8, knight takes pawn, and at this point, there's not much for black to do. He tries to advance. I play bishop f3, h5, rook takes c6, king g7, bishop takes pawn, rook attacks the bishop, bishop f3, and it was in this position my opponent out loud said, yeah, I don't think I can win this anymore. It was in this position he said that, and resigned the game. Now, I got quite a laugh out of him saying that after I'd been winning for 20 moves. But, you know, it's under 1,000, I understand. And we go to my next game. Now, my next game is actually against the guy who got second overall in the tournament with 4.5 out of 5. And also drew against my friend in the final round. And now, here, I knew I was going to be playing as black. And I was really worried about d4 because e4, if you know, I play e6. Like, no matter what. d4, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to play, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what I was going to play. And then my opponent showed up to the board and played c4. And I was caught off guard immediately, so I tried to remember like what I normally play here, but I was kind of at a disadvantage from the start. And here, I have to play here, and on d5, which is like the only move for white, I have to take, and play bishop here or here. This is and this is what I forgot. I couldn't remember my move here to save my life because I thought this was coming. I was going to lose my pawn. I just completely panicked and played queen a5 check. Knight c3, bishop out again. I have to play bishop c4 here. Or sorry, c5. If you can hear my dog barking in the background, I apologize. Bishop d2 is played. I take, and here he throws in bishop takes f6, and I'm stuck in this position where the pawns are equal. However, look at my pawns and look at my pieces compared to his pieces. Here I play knight c6. He plays knight h3. d5, bishop back, defending his knight, and I play bishop e6. He plays knight f4. I thrust my pawn forward because I didn't see any other way to protect it, although I knew this exchange was coming and he was going to go up a pawn. And after this, I elect for king e7. He castles, and I try and trade a pair of rooks. He doubles his rooks. I played rook d5 because if he trades, I felt like I could maybe hold this position. However, he doesn't do that. He plays a really nice move, e4. So now I'm forced to trade. Rook b8 attacking his pawn, b3, rook b5. So now we have this position where I'm pretty much playing to hold a draw in a rook in game while down a pawn. My opponent plays f4. I play rook c5 to try and get in, rook a4, a5, king f2. Here I play rook c2 check, and he just gives me the pawn. He takes the pawn, and I play rook b2, kind of limiting his movement on the queen side as much as I can, and he plays king d4. I play rook d2 check, king c5, rook c2 check, and king d6. And if you want to replay on that, he played f4, walked his king in, I gave a check. Sorry about that. My opponent just walked his king all the way to b6. And I play king f7 to stop rook a7 taking my h-pawn. But he plays rook c5 trying to get a rook trade. Obviously, I can't do that. He takes with his king. I play rook b2 trying to get at his pawn. He plays rook c3 defending pretty much everything in his position except one pawn that I try and go for. And he plays b4. And the point is, if I take his pawn, he plays b5, and I lose. I can't stop his pawn. So what I try is I bring my rook back to a2 and try and go back this way, inducing a trick. If you push your pawn, I actually win. For example, this, I'm just completely winning here. However, he doesn't do that. He correctly plays king b7, rook a5, and in this position, after king c7, I resigned the game. And now, I was not happy, obviously, to lose in the third round, and this was actually the last game of the day. We came back on the Sunday and had to play 2 more games. And I once again had the black pieces. I'm just going to move on. There's nothing more to say about that game. I didn't really know the opening too well, and my opponent punished me for it. And my 4th game, this game is just tragic, to be honest. There's not much more to describe it than tragic. This opponent actually does play d5, and I did decide that I was going to play the Slav defense like I saw it in my 2nd game, because I just felt like I could defend this position very well. I go for this triangle system, and my opponent plays bishop g5, I play bishop e7, e3 is played, and I trade in the center of the board. My opponent takes, I play h6, h4, and I jump my knight to the middle. He trades on e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, pawn takes d5, and he gives bishop b5 check, bishop d7 is played, and we trade, and he plays rook c1. Now I castle, he castles, rook c8 is played, queen b3, and knight b6, defending my pawn, maybe with some ideas of knight c4, and it was in this position my opponent played e5. And out here I took my time and was trying to think of what the best move would be. I looked at knight c4, I looked at f6, I looked at rook c5, obviously that's not playable because the knight takes, but I did look at it briefly. And I started looking at this nice idea, rook c7. The point is, if you trade, I take control of the c file just pretty much for the rest of the game. f6 is going to come, rook c8, and I'm going to have a nice position. And then, so my opponent decides not to go into that. You also don't really want to let me double my rooks. And he tries to double his rooks himself, but I take. The point is, if you take with the pawn, I'm going to play rook c8, and I'm going to start bringing my pieces and stockpile pressure on this pawn until I can win it. So because of that, my opponent takes with the queen. I still play rook c8, and he goes back. Now I play queen c7, taking control of the c file. b3, queen c2, takes, and a4. So now I go rook b2. I'm going to win this pawn. He tries to get creative, plays a5, knight c8, knight d3, takes here. Now here, I took about 10 minutes to think where I wanted to put my rook. I was thinking here, I looked at this briefly, rook b2, that's about it, rook b4. I just trying to find the best square. And in all of these positions, I was like, okay, my next move is going to be knight d6, because, well, besides rook a3, but I ruled that out fairly quickly. My next move is going to be knight d6. And I think at some point during my calculation, my brain just started thinking, okay, knight d6 is your move. And that's what I played. And my opponent sat back down in his chair. He was looking at other games. Played knight b3. And got up and left. So I had to sit there for like 5 minutes for my opponent to come back to the board so I can resign the game. And of course, this was my first game of the day. I was not happy with this, obviously, because, I mean, I just hung a rook in a completely winning position. So we go to the final game. And I once again have the white pieces, d4, d5, c4, and e6. Now I go into my Catalan we go into this weird variation with bishop b4 check, and he doesn't trade, so I take, knight c3, castles, bishop g2, rook e8, castles, and b6. b6 was the first weird move that my opponent played, so I jump my knight into e5. Everything I've done is relatively standard, and it also, knight e5 not only puts my knight on a nice square, if he ever decides to take, I can take back without having to go out of my way to win the pawn back. However, he plays c5. Now c5 is an interesting move, just putting all the tension in the middle of the board, just as much as there can be. It's just a very provocative move, and I played d takes c5, b takes c5, and queen a4. Now there's actually a winning move here. It's a3. You just kick the knight out and play very soundly. And another thing to notice here, you can't like push, for example, because you lose your rook. There's just lots of weird pins going on, and part of the reason I wanted to move my queen was after a3 I wanted to play rook d1, adding another pin so you can't even take this pawn later on in the position. Here my opponent plays queen d6, I play f4, protecting my knight, and also keep in mind d4 still isn't possible. However, he plays rook b7, allowing for d4 because his bishop would be protected. So here I spent some time thinking. I didn't want to allow d4, so I took his pawn. And in every line I calculated, it was d takes. Because my point was, if you take with the knight or bishop, I have e4, which abuses this pin to win a piece. And then my opponent took with the knight, and then I realized, oh shit. If e4, there's knight takes c3, and I'm in trouble. And then I calculated one move further. This happened in the game, by the way. And the reason I allowed this is because there's this really nice tactic, queen e8. Queen takes rook. And after rook takes queen, I can take his queen, and I'm simply up in exchange. And here, I think after this, my opponent kind of lost all hope, because he played knight c7, allowing me to take. And then he played f5, I took. Then he took back, allowing me to take his bishop. I think he kind of just lost it after I went up in exchange. And a few moves later, we trade down, and it was in this position my opponent resigned the game. So I finished with 3 out of 5. I could have maybe finished with 4 out of 5 if I won my 4th game in the better position where I hung a rook. So yeah, on May 22nd, I am playing in the Ontario Chess Challenge, which is an online tournament. Actually, I'm really happy that I got a classical tournament in, because the tournament, I believe, is 25 plus 15, or 25 plus 5, or something like that, which is obviously a lot longer of a game than I'm used to, but hopefully this kind of helped me prepare for that. But yeah, the only real other thing I have to mention is this tournament kind of helped me like get back into chess, because I hadn't really been practicing. I'd still been playing, but I hadn't been practicing or trying to get better really, outside of simply just playing. But since this tournament, I've actually gone up in rapid, bullet, and blitz rating. So I'm not sure if me just looking at stuff for this tournament helped that, or maybe I'm just starting to play a little bit better. I'm not entirely sure. But either way, I've been playing better, so I don't mind. My friend got 3rd place in this tournament, so congrats to him. He lost 2nd place on tie breaks. Fun fact, if I didn't win my last game, he would have gotten 2nd because of how the tie breaks work. But yeah, I'm gonna sign off for now. I stream on Twitch, although I'm taking a small break for now, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out.